There it is. All right, well, welcome everybody to the launch of the Concussion Legacy Foundation Media Project. I'm Chris Nowinski, co-founder and CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and I am very proud to be joined by this esteemed panel today. To my left is a man who needs no introduction, but I will anyway, the legendary broadcaster Bob Costas. To his left is Olivia Stomsky, and I don't want to mess up your title, so I'm sorry to look down. Director of the Newhouse Sports Media Center at Syracuse University. To her left is J.A. Adande, the Director of the Sports Journalism Program at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. To his left is Dr. Robert Cantu, co-founder of the Concussion Legacy Foundation and our medical director. Thank you guys for joining. So this program really was launched many years ago, really when I met Dr. Cantu, because a concussion ended my career as a professional wrestler. And Dr. Cantu taught me a lot about concussions that would have changed my outcome. And ever since then, we started the Concussion Legacy Foundation in 2007 to take some of those ideas and to educate on concussions to the public. And what's been interesting is that with all the work that we've done to educate the public over the last decade, recent studies have showed we've made a lot of progress, but we aren't yet reaching enough people. And we're especially not reaching the most vulnerable populations out there. The CDC recently published a study that showed families from the lowest income brackets, below $35,000 a year, fewer than half of those children receive any formal concussion education. Another study by the Sports and Fitness Industry Association found fewer than half of football coaches at the youth level have had training on concussions, and only 26% of soccer coaches at the youth level. And so Dr. Cantu and I have been going school to school trying to teach these lessons, but we sat down and thought for a second, what might be a better way to reach these really hard to reach groups? And that idea came from watching sports. We've worked very hard and very well with the media to educate through the media, and we're excited to have Alan Schwartz here in the room, who won many, many awards for the New York Times for the many stories he wrote beginning 10 years ago. But really the biggest audiences are in television, are in radio, and we need to reach all, we can reach a lot more people if we can use sports on television to educate on concussions. That's the way the Concussion Legacy Foundation sees it. And one of the great challenges we have right now is that the landscape on concussions has changed dramatically over the last decade. And so when I was playing sports, we would call a concussion a ding or a bell ringer, or it seemed normal if you got hit in the head that you would shake it off and go back out there. And some of those ideas still exist and are being shared through sports on television and through media coverage. And we realized if we could actually get everybody up to speed on the latest guidelines on concussions, it would allow those families at home, like the family you see here watching sports, watching a football game, to learn these lessons. And so, so that's where the Concussion Legacy Foundation Media Project came from. It's now 2 tracks, but the first track, and what we really want to talk about today, is the Concussion Reporting Workshop. And it was developed out of a conversation I had with Bob Costas in sharing this idea that, how could we use sports in sports media, and knowing that sports is the most popular thing on television, to teach those really hard to reach groups. So Bob, would you please share, well, using this microphone.
I think they can all hear me.
Well,
right?
for the video.
Oh, for the video.
Yes, yes. Is it on?
I'm new to this.
Yeah, it's on.
Is it on?
We good?
Okay.
All right, thank you. How our conversation led to what we're going to talk about next?
Well, all of it evolved over a period of time. My personal sense became many, many years ago, 20 years or more ago, I began to feel at best ambivalently about football in particular and some other contact sports. But football is the biggest and the most popular and the most profitable and the one that I was most associated with at NBC. And actually, I asked out of it in 1993 because of my growing ambivalence about not just the tolerance of violence, but the celebration of violence in football. I didn't make an issue out of it, I just stepped aside from it. When HBO asked me to be one of the hosts of Inside the NFL, I accepted that assignment because they often took a journalistic look at football issues, and they weren't just celebrating the games, and I didn't have to narrate the highlights. Those were all provided by NFL Films. In 2006, when NBC reacquired football and made Sunday Night Football into an extravaganza, part of the understanding was that at least now and then I'd be able to do halftime commentaries about whatever I considered interesting, and often they were just appreciations or humorous or ironic things, but sometimes they were on more serious issues, including head trauma and including football's undeniable connection to CTE. Reading all of Alan's work through the years further educated me, further convinced me that there was no separating the two. And Alan, I think, may recall, I think he was there at the Super Bowl in 2012 in Indianapolis when we did an entire town hall meeting involving the commissioner and team owners and broadcasters and writers and players, past and present. And so I felt as if I was at least moving the ball in the right direction. And even though I was never able to do the sort of in-depth work that Alan was able to do at the Times, or that Brian Gumbel could do on Real Sports on HBO, because you don't have as much time, I always felt that 2 minutes utilized well in front of that large an audience and in that context, so that the very network that partnered with the league and in front of the biggest audience with the field behind you, if someone who you associated with it was at least acknowledging the elephant in the room, that would have an impact that would be greater than if I were on some other outlet on a more regular basis speaking at greater length. And it might call people's attention to it and direct them toward Dr. Cantu's work, toward Ann McKee's work, toward the Concussion Legacy Foundation, to going back into the archives and taking a look at what Alan had written. And so I tried to do that through the years, to call attention to the movie Concussion, to familiarize myself with Bennett Amalu and his work, and to read his book. And I went up to Boston, and Ann McKee and Dr. Cantu took me through kind of a 101 class in CTE. Here's a normal brain of a 50-year-old man. Here's the brain, and you look for the tau proteins, and here's the brain of someone who has played contact sports. And the evidence began to accumulate to such an extent that it is now undeniable, even if, sadly, too many of those who cover football, especially on television, are reluctant to even acknowledge it. Forget about expressing an opinion about it, forget about advancing the conversation, reluctant to even acknowledge it. But, as Chris said, more and more members of the media now recognize that even if they still embrace football for all of its excitement and athleticism and shared experience, that there is no separating this issue from the game itself. And that being the case, it's not enough just to move past the idiocy of grown men acting like drunken frat boys not that long ago on ESPN in the "he got jacked up" segment, which was a regular feature. Like, you were supposed to revel in this, like, this is great, we can't get enough of this. But the only difference between those plays which they selected was that somebody didn't wind up paralyzed from that hit, or didn't wind up specifically and directly suffering from CTE as a result of that hit. And we've moved past that, but we're still not to the point where enough, and I think J.A. would agree with this, and Alan would probably agree with it, not enough, broadcasters especially, but also writers, understand the nuances of this. They still think that it's primarily about concussions. And many still think that you only have a concussion when you are unconscious. Well, you can have a concussion without losing consciousness, but more importantly, you can suffer cumulatively CTE from hundreds and thousands, in many cases, of subconcussive hits. To the best of my knowledge, Junior Seau, who played 20 years in the National Football League, and many years prior to that in college and in high school, he never had a diagnosed concussion. But he wound up killing himself the same way Dave Duerson wound up killing himself. He wound up in the same place. And it's necessary for members of the media to understand these nuances, these differences in degree, and to have the proper terminology. Just because a guy doesn't go down and have to be carried off on a stretcher, it's not enough to say, well, he's shaking off the cobwebs. They need to know what the protocols are. Just as it's incumbent upon me, if I'm calling a baseball game, to know the infield fly rule, they should know what the rules are concerning someone who might have been concussed, concerning when he can return to play, when he can return to practice, what the emerging science is. You don't have to be a scientist yourself. I'll never understand it as well as Dr. Cantu does, but you want to understand it well enough not to mislead the audience, or not to soft pedal the severity of an issue, a significant issue. And at the same time, we want to equip broadcasters and writers with proper information, not just as we sit here today, but on an ongoing basis, because it's ever evolving. And we recognize that there are different circumstances. If Al Michaels is calling a game, or Jim Nantz or Joe Buck is calling a game, there's a limit to how much they can say, not because they're constrained, but the dynamics of it. The next play is coming. So they ought to be properly versed, as I'm sure those three people are. They ought to be properly versed in what we now know about concussions and football's connection to CTE and other contact sports, so that they can acknowledge something that has happened and keep you properly informed and use the right terminology. It's not their place to deliver a treatise or a commentary, because the format will now not allow for it. But that can be done in other places. It can be done on Bob Lee's programs, Outside the Lines, on ESPN. It can be done on an E60 or a 30 for 30. It can be done on HBO. It could be done occasionally when I was doing it at halftime or on a pregame of a football game. So if we're going to do it, we might as well be as well informed about it as possible. If you're going to call the game, you want to be as well informed about the players, the coaches, the history of the teams in the league as possible. And since this is an aspect of football in particular, and other sports as well, that cannot be separated from the sport, if you're going to be well prepared, you might as well know the whys and wherefores of it. So we decided that it would be a good idea to make available to as many writers and broadcasters as possible the best available ongoing information, digestible to the layman, transferable from that lay person who's a writer and broadcaster to his or her readership or audience. And why not partner with two of the most esteemed journalism departments in the country? My alma mater, Syracuse, represented by Olivia, and Northwestern, the Medill School of Journalism, J.A. Adande, long-time writer for the Los Angeles Times and other publications, who knows the field but now is an academic himself. This seems like a good combination, a good partnership. And the idea is not to proselytize. The idea is to make sure that the commentary is informed. And then people can draw their own conclusions about whether they want their kids to play or how they want to respond to the information. But the information ought to be available.
Thank you. And thank you for all your help in making this happen. So Bob first introduced me to Olivia and said we should create a program that can be taught in journalism schools. And so that's really phase one of this program. And don't forget, Andrea Kramer has also been helping us on this, and this is also being taught in the spring at Boston University, but she can't be here because she's calling the Thursday night game tonight, which is very exciting. But so Olivia, please talk about what hearing this idea, what your first thought was, and then what we've been doing since, and how it went having this class actually taught, having the concussion reporting workshop taught on Monday by you.
So from the beginning, this was a very exciting thing for me. As a live game producer, it's so important we tell play-by-play, sideline, never speculate, right? We're not doctors, but we are journalists. And we may be journalists about sports and athletes and teams, but we're journalists. So we do have an obligation to be accurate. And in order to be accurate, we need to know what the right terms are. We need to know what the protocols are. I completely agree. There aren't a lot of times where we can, as sports journalists, go into that, especially live. But it's so important for us to make sure we give our students all of the tools that they can before they leave our universities. And one of those tools is teaching them how to accurately call a brain injury live. You don't have time to look up, rules and protocols. You don't have time to think about it. Right then, you have seconds, if at all, to say what you have to say. And if we can make sure that our students are learning those protocols, learning the accurate terminology before they leave our campuses, we can keep them from making those mistakes. We can keep them from being irresponsible when reporting about, brain injuries, by not calling them head injuries, by saying, here's the signs, not the symptoms, and we understand what all of those things mean. And so it's so important to me that we've done that, and we taught the curriculum this last Monday in our radio sports broadcasting class. And the students were so engaged and asked so many questions along the way. Some of those questions were, what if your analyst says the incorrect thing? What do we say then? Or can you say this? As a part of it, we have a piece where we have a play that is completely silent. And so we watched it silent, and then our students called it with what they thought they should say. Then we listened to it and pieced together what was good and what wasn't good. And it was so great for them to be so engaged in this conversation, constantly saying, once you've learned something, you can't unlearn it. So at least we're aware of the words we're using, and using them on purpose is so important. And then the discussion of whether or not they thought about any of this beforehand, right? And how much more attention they need to pay to the fact that we are held accountable for what we say. And sure, it is sports and it's quick and you don't have time to think. So we need to, as Bob said, we need to know what the protocols are and the terminology just as well as we know the rules to the game, or the players' names and the pronunciations, right? And so it's just been great for our students to be a part of this.
Well, thank you. And J.A., you taught the first class on this October 22nd at Medill. Can you talk about your reaction to this idea when I first called you, and your experience previously teaching injuries, and what it's been like to teach this 3-hour workshop?
I was very honored and excited to be a part of this. One of the great things about being at Medill, it's like this experience at Syracuse, and I'm sure, is that so much of the work has been done before you, and just to be thought of, to be included in this, really was a result of the work and the success of the professors and the students and what they've gone on to do in their careers over the years. And it seemed automatic to me once I was asked to be a part of this. And I taught as an adjunct professor at USC. My first class was a sports PR class, even though it wasn't my area of expertise. That was the opportunity that became available to me. And one of the things I wanted to make sure my students took from that class was an understanding of injuries and proper terminology, the difference between a strain and a sprain, for example, the different degrees of strains and sprains that you can have. A lot of times we don't really understand what those terms are when we see them and we hear them and we even use them without understanding the proper terminology. And so that was one component. This is something that's even more important, though, because this is something that can affect people's lives and that can be utilized and experienced by youth sports participants, for example. And so it's important for our students to understand this as they go out and become professional journalists, and it is important to utilize this platform that we have. Bob didn't mention it, but when he was hosting Sunday Night Football, he was hosting the most watched television program in the country consistently week in and week out. What a tremendous platform that is. What an incredible opportunity that is to educate and opine, but primarily he used it to educate. I think it's great that he got
when
it.
permitted.
But took that opportunity, even if it was just a couple of minutes at halftime, you took that opportunity to make sure that we were having this discussion. That's something that's always appealed to me about sports journalism in particular. Probably the reason I became a writer first, I didn't realize that you would have these opportunities to opine and to expand the discussion. But I always viewed sports journalism an opportunity to have discussions about greater societal issues through the prism of sports, through the opportunity of sports. And this is a societal issue. This is not something that is just affecting a segment of NFL players, and an alarmingly large segment of NFL players, but that is still not a greater part of our society. But what are we doing to the youth sports participants? How are we looking out for them? How are we making sure that the parents are making informed decisions about whether to have their kids play these sports? The people that are involved for overseeing the sports, the coaches, and high school and college athletic trainers. How educated are they, and how educated are the people that are covering these sports even at that level? So that's why this is something that is so important to me and everyone that you see here on this panel. Proper terminology is everything, and that's where it starts. Understanding how to describe these things. When I first got my column at the LA Times, I was in the Orange County edition covering a lot of Mighty Ducks games. And Paul Correa, their star, had been in a contract holdout, and no sooner does he come back a game or two later, it seems like he's out with a concussion. And then just like the contract story had dragged on and on, this concussion story actually wound up taking a long time because he just couldn't shake the symptoms. And we thought, you're kind of taught as you watch sports, shake it off, why can't you get back in there? But at that time, I first learned that a concussion is an ongoing event. The symptoms might not be readily available and apparent. The signs might not be apparent. We just saw it recently, a couple weeks ago, with the NBA. And Giannis Antetokounmpo, who was hitting the head and looked a little glassy, and they released a report he was cleared to return, but then it turned out later that he had suffered a concussion. But if you understand the details and what goes into this, then you understood that yes, concussions can be an evolving, ongoing event, and maybe he might be okay initially, but then as the issue continues to spread, he has to go into protocol. Then understanding what that means once he goes into the protocol. In the NBA, there are certain tests that you have to pass without showing any symptoms as you gradually ramp up the exertion level, and until you can pass all those steps, you are not cleared to return. It's so important to understand the protocol. That's what I want to, just as Bob alluded to, you wouldn't cover a game not understanding the rules. Well, these are now part of the rules. These have been implemented. And so to be aware, even if you don't have all the details down, to at least be conscious of their existence and understand that these are things that you need to report on. I had to do a live TV shot before a game, and there was a player dealing with the protocol, and I wasn't sure about the details. And I called up one of the NBR PR people, and he kind of chided me. He said, "We had a release about that back in December. You should know that." And I went back and looked at the timing of the release. Well, it was right in the midst of the Chris Paul trade, with him being nixed for the trade that went to the Lakers, and then him subsequently being traded to the Clippers. But I think it's interesting that we didn't take the announcement of the concussion protocol as seriously as we did the Chris Paul trade discussions. That's why it kind of slipped from my mind. It was overshadowed by this Chris Paul trade. This is just as important, and I think it's important that we let our media peers understand the importance of this, and that we certainly let our students, for a living and myself, become aware of the seriousness, but also the steps that are necessary that you can accurately report to the extent of your knowledge just what is taking place, and just what should take place anytime you see someone who has suffered an apparent concussion.
Thank you, J.A. So Dr. Cantor, I'm putting myself in your shoes right now. You must be thrilled to hear this conversation, because for so many of us, all this education starts with you and your decades of work for many, many years, and now we're all preaching your message. So would you talk a little bit about what you think about this program and its ability to actually make youth athletes safer and make families safer with regard to concussion, and a little bit more about how we've baked some neuroscience into this program to really make it effective?
Chris, I do find it very, very exciting, and certainly Bob and all the panelists have pointed out what a marvelous educational opportunity the broadcasters have. I think back in my 40 years in this field, and the hundreds, if not thousands, of medical meetings I've gone to. Well, all of them together, the the people that were there are a fraction of what turns into one NFL game. But I do see it as multifactorial. I see it as educational in terms of the proper recognition of concussion signs and symptoms. I see it educating broadcasters so they won't do what Bob pointed out some of them have done in the past, and that is perhaps misusing some of the terms and glorifying some things that shouldn't be used. But I also see it, I hope, as even making the broadcast more informative and more interesting. For instance, the NFL has spotters in the booth. Those spotters in the booth are primarily former NFL athletic trainers. But those athletic trainers are used to evaluating an athlete on the field where they get to talk to them, they get to examine them. Up in the booth, all they can do is look down and look at them. And you can't tell whether somebody has amnesia from the booth, and you can't say whether they're a little bit confused most of the time either. But you can see whether there's gross motor instability. You can see if they're not moving at all. You can see if they're gripping their head. And you can definitely see if they're posturing, which is synonymous with being unconscious, because that only happens when you're unconscious. And although it's not common, if you do see unconsciousness, that is a concussion. So educators, the broadcasters could be educated with regard to the same kinds of things those spotters are looking for. And when they see them, because they're up in the booth as well, they could be making comments, another set of eyes, another set of now educated eyes. So I think it's extremely important from that standpoint. I think it's hugely important from the youth education standpoint. Our youth look up to coaches, of course, and they look up to the athletes, and of course they look up to the broadcasters as well. And to the extent that we have the proper information about not playing symptomatic and recognizing somebody who might be symptomatic and therefore taking them off the field to be evaluated, we can be saving lives, because especially at the youth level, every year we still have second impact syndrome fatalities. That's a totally preventable injury if the individual is not allowed to play symptomatic. We're very, very proud of the program that's been put together. The program itself involves 21 different courses, and all aspects of the concussion are covered, such as before the event, what's happening at the time of the event, what's happening at the time a diagnosis of concussion is made, and what's happening after concussion in terms of proper management. The course material is involving a micro-learning platform called QStream, which was developed at Harvard. QStream's CEO, Richard Chapman, is right here in the audience, and we're very pleased to have him here. This is a platform that allows you, because you're getting small bits of information repetitively, to learn it, salt it away, and not forget it in the future, as opposed to a great amount of information that you may retain for a short period of time, but some months and years later, you're not going to be able to retain it. There also is a guideline, 5 fast facts for broadcasters, things that could be kept at their microphone, so to speak, so that they're looking for them or aware of them, can comment on them. And finally, I'd like to thank, as Chris has mentioned, Andrea Kramer. Andrea is an advisor to this project. She's a lecturer at BU School of Medicine. She would love to be with us here tonight, but tonight she's working. She's part of the all-girl NFL team calling NFL football game tonight. And probably more importantly, she is the first concussive reporting certified broadcaster broadcasting of football. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Bob. So I think that wraps up. We covered everything. Yeah, so as Bob mentioned, I'll just show this to you. We spent months together sort of boiling down the knowledge into what we're calling the 22 do's for covering concussions. So the idea is that we don't do these things, we do these things. We don't say ding or bell ringer anymore. We shouldn't say head injury. You're better off saying concussion or brain injury. So some exciting, simple concepts that everybody can work with. And then Bob mentioned the Fast 5 for broadcasters. Simple ideas like use appropriate terminology, know your protocols, that sort of thing. So we're trying to make this very usable. And so we're excited that we now have this pilot program where the concussion reporting workshop is being taught at 3 of the most prestigious journalism schools in the country, and we plan to expand that. So if you are at a journalism school and want this at your program, please reach out to us. You can go to concussionfoundation.org/media project. And then after this, we'll begin recruiting working journalists to actually pass the certification. So we've created a media toolkit, which the team was instrumental in putting together. We spent a day in the studio with Dr. Cantu, basically downloading his brain so you can get into all the nuance of these issues and the whys. And JA was very kind to have Medill students edit those videos and put them together, so thank you very much. So the media toolkit, you could get lost in there, but we've tried to put all the information you could ever need to know about concussions there as you prepare for that test. So I think from here, I want to say, first of all, thank you guys for putting this together with us. I mean, it's been a long time in the making, a lot of hard work. You know, a lot of dropping Bob's name in conversation, saying, Bob Costas thinks it's a good idea, you should too. But thank you very much, and I'll open the floor to questions. And we have a microphone for it too. And I know some people had one. Thank you.
Hi, my question's around kind of acceptance and acknowledgement of what's happening. I kind of shuddered, Olivia, when you said to call a brain injury. It kind of, I pictured myself watching the television and hearing somebody say that, and I kind of shuddered. So I guess the question is, are you confident that this program and kind of the general education and the changing of terminology and what have you will really help to move the needle in terms of the acknowledgement of the bigger issue that's happening? Obviously, there's been some resistance in professional sports and college level sports to the fact that this is happening. I saw that in the documentary. But is this kind of new education, the tweaking of the terminology, do you really think it's going to help the general public to understand the degree of the severity of this issue?
I don't think the information that's being disseminated
Bob, you need a microphone so we
in
can pick you
the
up.
courses is really new or novel. I think it's important to understand concussion is a traumatic brain injury. Fortunately,
Don't want the people at home to hear.
fortunately, one that is recoverable in most instances in a fairly short period of time, and in about 20% of the time it's more prolonged, and a very small percent it's a permanent injury, as opposed to CTE, which is a neuropathological brain disease. So I think this is just a way of getting the current thinking out there to the public. It's not new or novel thinking. It's not changing anything within the medical community.
Yeah, and I'll add it's very much focused on concussion right now, because concussion is what comes up in the broadcast. And regarding terminology, I'll just mention there is actually a study that shows that if a kid shows up to the emergency room, they randomized whether the child was told they had a concussion or they had a brain injury. And what they found is that the parents thought the brain injury was worse, and they were more they paid more attention to that child, and they were more conservative when they put them back into sports. And so it shows the effectiveness of using the right term and helping a child get better care. And so we're taking advantage of the fact that journalists want to be the best they can be at their job. And so we're just telling them, here's the knowledge we have. And if you use the word concussion, people will be better off. If you use the word brain injury, people will take it even more seriously, because that's an appropriate term for what's happening. Now I'll let you.
And I'll just respond because I said it, and you're right. I cringed as well, and my students, when we taught it, cringed, because brain injury sounds scary, and that's the point. I think that's the point. When we've been covering, especially by the media, concussions as if they're light, and you should get back, and if you're tough, you'll play the next game quicker, and you shouldn't. But then all of a sudden we say brain injury. Well, it is different than getting a scratch on your forehead, which is a head injury. And does it sound scary? Yes, but it is scary, and it's accurate that that's what it is. And so do we have to change how we say things? Sure, but as Doctor said, it's nothing new, or, it's not brand new. It's just the way it should have been the whole time.
Go ahead, Alan.
Of course.
I think one thing I was hoping the panel could take a whack at is that when these journalists become educated and they start using the right terms, they will also find themselves perhaps scrutinizing a team's treatment of a player. Okay? and will then face backlash. You're not a doctor. What do you know? Goodness knows I heard that a few times. So I'm wondering now, I would think Bob and J.A., you guys have the stature to get away with questioning people in power. What does the regular reporter do when he or she is frankly causing trouble and perhaps risking access and relationships by following the lessons that you guys are talking about?
That's why we're having Jim Acosta become the lead reporter on all football broadcasts, because he understands paying the price for asking tough questions. This is not on either, is it? What am I supposed to do here?
Sorry, it's on the bottom.
They turn it on for me, Jay. I just sit down and start talking. Yeah, first of all, I think it's essential that the network, the station, the newspaper, the magazine have the reporter's back. Now, if the reporter acts irresponsibly or is ill-informed, then he or she has to be held to account for that. But if the questions are reasonable and pertinent, and if the issues raised are pertinent, and if somebody decides that they're going to come down on that reporter for that, either by denying them access or treating them in a harsh way, somebody on their side has to have their back. The way, and I'm not drawing a direct analogy, CNN has Acosta's back as we speak. But I also think that we need to recognize the distinctions. I think it would be not just impractical, but ineffective for, during the course of calling a game, for someone to say, unless some extraordinary circumstance pointed in this direction, for someone to say, you realize that participation in youth football is down by 20% overall, or it's down by even more than that in New England, but it's down by less than that in the South or in the Southwest because there are cultural differences. Those are all legitimate points, but probably better made in pregame discussions or on HBO or at halftime if anyone is inclined to go there. But the play-by-play announcer or the color person, for example, Chris Collinsworth is extremely well informed about this, extremely well informed about the protocols, but I've never heard him proselytize. I've never heard him say, so therefore, even as you enjoy this game, you should not let your kids play. The important thing is to get pertinent and reliable information out there and then let people make informed decisions of their own. I think the big difference, if we're just talking now about football, and we know that this applies elsewhere, it applies in baseball. Catchers get more head injuries and concussions, brain injuries, than other positions, which would only stand to reason. It's not just collisions at the plate, it's foul balls off the mask and whatnot. But we tend to focus on football. And I remember doing a commentary some years ago saying that at least one important difference between where we are now and where we were just a short time ago is that you have informed consent. If post-1964 someone decides to smoke, they can't logically claim they didn't know what they were getting into. If post the turn of this century, post Alan Schwartz's series of articles, post CLF's work, post the published work of Ann McKee and Robert Cantu, after they saw Will Smith star as Bennett Amalu in Concussion, no one who plays football, or almost no one who plays football, and we'll get back to your point in a second, you're excused, whoever that was, can logically claim that they lacked the information. And we can respect someone like Chris Borland, who was a promising linebacker for the 49ers, who said, you know what? The rewards are not, to me, worth the risk. But we can also respect others who say, I fully understand the risks, but the thrill and rewards of competition, the financial rewards for my family, I've weighed the risks and rewards, and I've made that decision. At least it's an informed decision. Whereas I think players of previous generations, you talk to Tony Dorsett, for example, he says players of my generation understood that when we were 50 years old, we'd quite likely feel creaky getting out of bed, or we might have to have a knee or a hip replaced, or we might have an arthritic condition. We didn't think we wouldn't recognize our kids or forget the way to drive home after we went to the grocery store. Now they know that this is a possibility. It's not a certainty. No one is saying that we're at the edge of Armageddon, but it's a serious issue, and it's a possibility that everyone who's involved in it, parent, coach, player, needs to be informed about. And from the live broadcast standpoint, while no one could get into it, even to the extent of the 4 or 5 minutes I've been speaking right now, simply acknowledging it. So many people watch football. If Chris Collinsworth, knowledgeably as he does, says, all right, this looks as if there could be a concussion involved, he's being taken off, he'll be taken into concussion protocol. Right now he's in the tent, then they'll take him off. He's unlikely to return. Michelle Tafoya uses the proper terminology when she reports from the sideline. Those things are not lectures about the pros and cons of football. They're reiterations of the facts that surround the game. And those things seep in and become part of the knowledge, along with more extensive looks at research or books or commentaries or conversations that take place in forums that are seen by a large number of people and that allow more depth. But just on the game itself, a well-worded, accurate 30-second reference can have an impact because millions of people watch those games.
And Bob, and I would say that would help lead to a cultural shift, which might not be the intent as you go about doing your job as a reporter, but it can be the byproduct. Bob spoke earlier about how they did have the Jacked Up segment and would celebrate violence. I think back to the infamous Terrell Owens Monday Night Football Open with the Desperate Housewives cast member. When she dropped a robe, there was implied nudity, and there was outrage over that. Well, then the very next week, they went back to their standard open, and what was it? It was two helmets smashing into each other and exploding, and it might have been animated, but just like there was implied nudity the week before, there's implied violence and head collisions, and this is something that was celebrated. And I think that's something that we've moved away from, and so by accurately reporting whether or not the processes are being followed, which is no different than a rules interpretation, and we ask now it's commonplace to have an official in the booth or easily accessible via satellite to
neurologist on the sideline.
Yeah, but we see that in the broadcast all the time. They're saying whether or not this replay is being handled or what the rules interpretations are. Why can't we have that for head injuries too, and whether or not the protocol is properly being followed? And so as we question and kind of get back to your earlier question, how can people question that? I would argue in some places it would be easier for somebody outside. Bob was in a somewhat precarious position because NBC, his employer, was also a partner with the NFL. Just as when I was covering the NBA with ESPN, they're partners with the NBA. So there's some, I wouldn't say restrictions, Bob, but it's delicate. Limitations is a great way to describe it. So even though Bob Costas might be in a prominent place, he's also in a precarious place given the nature of his employer's partnership with the leagues. So an outsider, maybe somebody that doesn't have the name or status of Bob Costas, at least doesn't have to worry about keeping so many different partners happy.
Now, before Bob asks that, do you need to go to the airport? I do. Okay. Well, thank you for being here. All right, I appreciate it. And going to a related event, which is the Chris Gedney Memorial.
I am.
No. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you for coming. Thank you.
Olivia,
Oh, that's helpful.
Good. You got to call that
I was
Uber.
gonna send my boarding pass too.
to go back to something that Alan mentioned, where he wrote this series of extremely important and influential articles in the New York Times about this, the emerging understanding of the connection specifically between football and brain injuries. And you get this, what? Are you a doctor? Was Walter Cronkite an astronaut? He covered the space program. Did Huntley or Brinkley hold political office? No. Was Michael Beschloss ever president? No, he's an historian. Was Doris Kearns Goodwin part of FDR's cabinet? No, she's an historian. All right, a journalist. Very few journalists cover only one thing or even only one sport. You can become informed about a wide variety of things. I've been around baseball for half a century. I've had to inform myself about analytics, which no one talked about when I was doing games in the 80s and 90s. If you're a sentient human being, you can learn things by talking to people who know a lot about it. And it's actually better that you not be that expert, because you then have an attentive layperson's understanding of it, and you communicate it, because that's what you're supposed to be able to do skillfully. You communicate it to your readership or to your audience. So this, especially in a social media world, this, oh, you're a doctor, all of a sudden thing. Basically, those kind of reactions, and I'm sure J.A. can attest to this, those kind of reactions, whether it's sports or whether it's politics, really only emanate from one place. You are saying or writing something I don't want to read or hear. And so rather than confront the argument on its merits, I will try to undermine your credibility or find some reason to dismiss you or to set up some straw man version of you that's easy to knock down, rather than deal with the merits of the issue. That's where that always comes from. And if we're going to be bothered by that, we're going to be bothered 24/7, because they're out there like locusts now, and there's just nothing you can do about it.
And one thing I've learned as a journalist, sometimes it's not important what you say so much as what you don't say or what you don't ask. And the more informed you are, sometimes you can be more informed about what not to say. I will never have as extensive a knowledge base about this topic as Dr. Cantu, but I can educate myself to know areas and things that I should not say, things that I should not ask, terms I should not use through programs such as this. So that's part of my response to people questioning my expertise. Well, at least I can be smart enough to know what I'm not saying, so I'm not spreading any misinformation.
Do you think that answered your question, Alan?
That was adequate.
Any other question? Go ahead. Excuse me. I'm supposed to take my eye drops right now.
Tomorrow's a big day.
Yeah, I know.
So we have a lot of questions online as well, so thank you guys. A lot of people watching. One question, especially for J.A. and Bob, is so this sort of formalizes a learning platform to understand this topic better. You guys have been journalists a long time. How did you catch up without a formalized program, or have you ever seen anything like this? Have you ever been educated on something like this, or is it the first of its kind? And if it is sort of the first of its kind, what will that mean for sort of that next generation of journalists?
First of its kind that I'm aware of, that I think J.A. and I were fortunately situated. For example, Alan and I were not well acquainted, but when I called Alan after reading his articles, or the first few of them, there were many to follow, he knew who I was, he returned my call. We established a conversation. We appeared in a documentary together. Chris reached out to me. So I'm reasonably well situated so that if I want to learn about it, and I did, I could get a first-hand tutorial from Robert Cantu and from Ann McKee. And J.A. had his background at the LA Times. But to your point, it is very important that the students at Northwestern and at Syracuse or at Boston University, and we hope in dozens, if not hundreds, of universities and high schools over time, that people who don't yet have a press credential or don't yet have a recognizable name will at least have a foundation of knowledge. But to answer your question, we just went out and learned it for ourselves.
You get up to speed. So you might not have one of the foremost experts available to you, such as Dr. Cantu, but the team physician or athletic trainer a lot of times will explain as you go. So a lot of these things I've learned on the fly, getting up to speed on the NBA's concussion protocol, for example, are things that you pick up. What's great about this program is that it can give journalists and student journalists a head start. So they'll be even better informed, and their base of knowledge, again, you shouldn't be expected to walk around and consider yourself a concussion expert, but at least you can have a base of knowledge, and you can also have a starting point for some of the questions that you do ask to the experts when you're working on a story.
Anything else from the Twitterverse, or are we good?
So I guess one more, just can you explain a little further, Chris or Dr. Cantu, QStream and sort of how that process of the, like what are journalist students being asked on QStream and how does that work?
Sure. So QStream we were lucky to find, because one of the big challenges of this program is we're teaching people something maybe while they're in school, and then a year later when this happens, or 5 years later, are they going to be able to know what to say at the moment of impact when they have that small window? And so QStream, the idea is it was generated for medical school students to retain information. And so with the students at Syracuse Northwestern, they're getting a pre-test that actually lets us identify what they already know and the things we need to focus the classroom time on. And then afterwards, they don't just pass this 21-question test and we know whether or not they know the information. They'll get 2 questions a day for the next little over a week. And then the ones they get wrong, they'll keep getting back. And they're scenario-based questions, very short, something you do on your phone. This happens, what's the right answer, A, B, C, or D? And the idea is that by interacting with that information over time, it's far more likely to be retained as long-term memories versus how many of us got through school, which was cramming, learn it, pass the test, and never hear about it again, and never remember anything. And so it's an exciting opportunity. Like if there was ever a need for this, like this is something where you don't know when the next time you have to apply this information is, but if you learn it and forget it, you're going to be useless to us. And so we're very excited to have QStream there to help us create long-term memories. And as neuroscientists, it's sort of cool to apply neuroscience to this program to make sure that we can help those kids.
No, I think it's also great, at least from my standpoint, to know that there are studies out there proving the efficacy of this. It's kind of self-intuitive to all of us that we learn a ton of stuff in a short period of time. Within the next day, we can probably regurgitate it, but a week later, we've probably forgotten most of it. It's not just learning batches that you can handle, but then making associations around it. So this idea of small batches, multiply fed, and then when you miss something, coming back to relearn it. It works.
Yeah. All right, great. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming and sitting through this. This is obviously a great opportunity for us to educate. So it's a little longer than the standard conference, but when you have real legends in their field, everybody here, legend in their field, it's a great opportunity. So thank you all for coming. Thank you guys. We'll thank you for watching at home, and we'll look forward. Remember, the last thing, go to concussionfoundation.org/media project to learn more, to sign up. And we'll see you there. Thank you.